Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, December 17th, 2019. Your humble host is refreshed after 2 days on the ski slopes at Lake Tahoe. Helped improve my attitude, my mental health, and my energy levels to get us through impeachment week. And then we'll be taking a couple of weeks off for the end of the year holidays. We have some rigged events that unify today's podcast stories, starting with the broad daylight rigging of the Senate impeachment trial. Now, the trial itself is not quite a go because we have some hoops to go through, including the full House vote on impeachment, which is not really in question. It's going to occur sometime Wednesday or maybe Thursday. The hearing Wednesday may be protracted by the antics of the Republicans. But Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, and Graham, one of the so-called leaders of the Trump supporters in the Senate, have made it clear over and over again in recent statements. They don't even project the pretense of being unbiased jurors to hear the case that is likely to be sent over from the House this week. And while we understand posturing, we understand, how politics works, the Clinton impeachment wasn't perfect, the Nixon impeachment wasn't perfect. But we didn't see this kind of grandstanding by the majority party. Before a single witness has been heard, before the criminal charges, the articles of impeachment, are presented to the senators for their consideration. And so at this point, to hear Mitch McConnell talk about how weak the case is and they shouldn't even be impeaching on this basis in the first place, this round is triggered by the weekend request of the minority leader, that's Chuck Schumer in the Senate, who gave a list of 4 witnesses. And it's clear this is not the complete list of witnesses the Democrats want to hear from in the impeachment trial. But it is kind of testing the waters on the part of Schumer. So his list included Bolton, the guy who called what Rudy Giuliani was working on, a drug deal, Mick Mulvaney, who went to the White House press room and said, yes, we did a quid pro quo with Ukraine. Get over it. And then there are a couple of other lesser people at the White House who Trump has been blocking from testifying. And this is what is so infuriating and insulting to any thinking American. As you know, I believe the Ukraine case is not the strongest to base impeachment on. I believe that the clear criminal behavior demonstrated in the Michael Cohen plea deal over the hush money paid to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal is a clear crime that warrants impeachment. And I'm still baffled why the Democrats don't just tuck it in there, for safety. But I believe that we see a clear conspiracy on the part of Trump's top officials, led by the volunteer Rudy Giuliani, but including appointees, including the Secretary of State, who were part of a very orchestrated plan to squeeze Ukraine, first under the Poroshenko government, which they thought would be reelected, and then under the Zelensky presidency. And I think that the Democrats have identified a clear violation of the Constitution. But even if you can say, it's a weak case, it's thin gruel, the obstruction of it is quite evident. The obstruction of Congress, the obstruction of all investigations. And so it is simply irrational, and it is, a created reality. When the Republicans play it off, say, it was just about policy, it's just a disagreement. President's got the right to do this. The phone call was perfect. Well, put that aside. The obstruction is out there in broad daylight. Trump brags about it. He's meeting with Giuliani on the day that the judiciary takes its vote. And so for McConnell to claim that Schumer's demands are dead wrong, claiming that Schumer doesn't understand the Constitution, and Schumer fired back, the Republicans haven't given one solid reason, one simple reason why a slate of Trump administration witnesses demanded by Democratic senators shouldn't appear during the impeachment trial. You know, when you don't have the facts, when you're afraid to argue why these witnesses shouldn't be here, you look for one diversion or another. McConnell responded, "From everything we can tell, House Democrats' slapdash impeachment inquiry has failed to come anywhere near, he repeated it, the bar for impeaching a duly elected president, let alone removing him for the first time in American history." And Graham has been brazenly candid that he's already made up his mind. He doesn't even need any witnesses. Now, anybody who is appointed a juror and operated in this manner would be immediately denounced by any sentient being who's aware of it. And you look at the history for the Clinton impeachment, Trent Lott was the Senate Majority Leader and Tom Daschle was the ranking Democrat. They actually were pretty fair to each side with a negotiated plan that had the unanimous backing of the chamber on the procedural plan, the procedural agreement. So this indicates, as I said in my somewhat depressed rant on Friday, that this is just a show. And these are people who don't take the Constitution seriously. I guess they figure that Trump might tweet at them, and that's worse than violating the Constitution. I'd love to see. There are, by the way, Move On is staging rallies in, I believe, 50 cities at 5:30 this afternoon. That's when the local event is here. I'll be showing up. And we see activism all around the globe, some of it descending into violence over much less significant issues, like subway fare increases. And Americans are content to sit there with their remotes and watch the show passively on their flat-screen TV. But will you get off the couch and demand that your rights be honored? Unfortunately, most Americans won't. So right now, today, Tuesday, the House Rules Committee, which, of course, is dominated by Democrats but has to put up with a lot of flack from Republicans, is working on the rules for tomorrow's procedures leading up to the impeachment vote. And a number of wobbly Democrats have now committed to vote for impeachment. There may be a few defections, but it's going to be a pure party line vote. There are 0 Republicans expected to vote in favor of the articles of impeachment this week. I mentioned Giuliani. We know that he was over in Ukraine and other places in Europe recording video propaganda for the One America network. I haven't watched it, but somebody who did and posted on Facebook just said this is not only propaganda, it's really bad propaganda. But Giuliani is ending his media silence. I guess the other day he spoke to Vanity Fair, and last night he gave an interview to the New York Times where he admitted, almost bragged about his role in the firing of American ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. I mean, he's even saying that, yeah, you know, I briefed the president a couple of times, and she was getting in the way. She was impeding investigations that he was running in Ukraine, and his efforts to gather evidence and target rivals. At least that's the accusation that has been leveled. Quoting Giuliani, there are a lot of reasons to move her. I think my information did play a role. I don't know, you'd have to ask them, but they relied on it. So he talked to Trump, and Trump arranged for Rudy Giuliani to have a phone meeting with the Secretary of State. And shortly thereafter, Mike Pompeo sent the order for Marie Yovanovitch to get out of Ukraine on the next plane. And so, for them to be so public about this, and Giuliani, who has no standing with the U.S. government, he is not a special envoy, he has no diplomatic authority, he's not working for the Justice Department as an investigator, even as a daily hire or something like that. I mean, this is so abnormal. And it's not in the service of actually trying to ferret out the truth. It is a political gambit. And so to watch them rig the impeachment trial, to watch them publicly admit their back-channel operation, it's a conspiracy. It's racketeering. And for Giuliani, again, who has no authority, to be bragging about his role, whatever it was, in booting Marie Yovanovitch, there should be howls of opposition from both parties about this. And there's another ethical question. It's number 900 or 9 million when it comes to Trump in the almost 3 full years that he's been in the White House. But this latest violation relates to Giuliani, who's been performing what is called legal work, and you and I might feel it has no value. It's worthless. But under the law, the hours that Rudy puts in service to Donald Trump, whether it's official or unofficial, is an in-kind contribution, a gift to Donald Trump. You could argue it's a campaign contribution. But in any event, it has to be reported in his annual ethics filing. And guess what? Trump didn't report it. And these kinds of violations in the past would have been, a real scandal. People would be running around with their proverbial hair on fire if they've got any. And instead, it's just, Trump, the grifter, doesn't follow the rules because he doesn't have to, and his party will not enable the enforcement of any rules against this guy. And that's where we end up with this Republican cult. Their loyalty to Trump is greater to the country or the Constitution. And at what point will their voters penalize them for that? That is the open question that we grapple with on a daily basis. I've got another case of rigging for you. This is the trial of the so-called Venezuelan embassy protectors. 4 of them have been accused and are before the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., Judge Beryl A. Howell presiding. And I know 2 of them, Margaret Flowers and Kevin Zeese. They're from Popular Resistance, and Kevin is an attorney. Margaret is a medical doctor. They're some kind of a couple. I've never really pried into their private lives. But they're on trial along with Adrian Pine and David Paul, the 4 individuals who remained in the Venezuelan embassy when it was occupied under the permission of the legitimate government of Venezuela run by Nicolas Maduro. And all this relates to the fantasy that Juan Guaido could simply proclaim himself the president of Venezuela, and the U.S. would say, that's fine, you can put your people in the embassy, and we just won't worry about it. Now, these 4 activists are facing a year in prison, a $100,000 fine, and Judge Howell has rigged this trial by denying discovery motions. For example, the jury will not be able to consider the contentious legality of the Trump administration's recognition of the leadership in Venezuela. And the legal charges the defenders are facing are inextricably linked to that. You have to identify who controls the Venezuelan embassy before you decide who can be there and who can't. And so this is another case that will be ignored by the corporate media because it's been selling us regime change in Caracas. And it would be inconvenient to divert the attention of average Americans to consider the principled stand that these people took to object to our government's fake recognition of Juan Guaido and to support the legitimate leader of Venezuela amid the bipartisan and media firestorms in favor of U.S. intervention. And I've got a fresh exhibit for you today in the Washington Post. Headline, Juan Guaido promised to save Venezuela. Now the flame he lit is petering out, and his U.S. backers are weighing their options. This is the Washington Post that lionized Juan Guaido as the freedom fighter in Venezuela, taking on the corrupt, kleptocratic, and violent regime, socialist to boot. And now, in a kind of even-handed whitewash of the history of the past year, the Washington Post says, well, our guy's in trouble. He lit the flame of hope, and now it is flickering. A year later, Maduro, a far wilier and more resilient than his opponents calculated, is still comfortably ensconced in the presidential palace. And the Venezuelans Guaido once inspired are losing faith in the opposition he leads, in its backers in the Trump administration, and for some, in Guaido himself. So he's disposable now, based on the Beltway view. And I find it fascinating because when they talk about the events of last February, they don't talk about how that whole humanitarian aid and the blockade at the Colombian border was a staged photo op, and how the one truck that was set on fire by Guaido supporters and blamed on soldiers who were loyal to Maduro. And that was all exposed. But the Washington Post can't recall that or doesn't think it's important enough to include in this. I printed out 16 8x10 pages. But it's clear they've washed their hands of Juan Guaido. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I want to thank Polina Vasilev. Mary Vogt just reorganized her PayPal account to keep the money coming. Thank you, Mary. I appreciate that. Raul Castillo is a $10 a month contributor. And Peter Hoffmeister, he chooses to give $5 a month. What could you do for the Peter B. Collins Podcast? And it is the season, so go ahead and get seasonable, reasonable, and go over to peterbcollins.com. Click on the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and it's easy for you to choose a level of support that's comfortable for you. If you don't like PayPal, I understand. You can reach me through the U.S. mail at Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. I mentioned rigging as kind of the unofficial theme of today's podcast, and the Republican vote riggers are surfacing in full effect right now. Item from Harper's Magazine under the byline of Andrew Coburn. They take on the case of Tennessee, where back in 2018, Tequila Johnson, an African-American administrator at Tennessee State University, led a mass voter registration drive. It led to a bigger turnout. It led to changes in Memphis and Nashville. Progressive candidates and causes achieved notable successes. They captured the mayor's office in Shelby County. In Nashville, a local measure was passed introducing a police accountability board, and the Republicans said, that's enough. So they have virtually criminalized independent voter registration campaigns. They passed a bill that placed mass registration drives under state control and criminalizing mistakes made on applications. The bill imposed heavy fines for any group that turned in multiple incomplete applications, mandated severe penalties for failing to submit registration forms within 10 days of being signed, required any person registering voters to receive official certification and government-administered training. Now, the Republicans all stand piously there and support this legislation and say it's to keep our elections fair. But a federal judge more or less laughed at this and described this is a district court judge, described the law as a complex and punitive regulatory scheme. But Tennessee isn't alone. In Florida, successful litigation to prevent a ban on pop-up early polling stations on college campuses has been countered with a measure requiring any college hosting such sites to ensure extra parking. This is like these, pretextual abortion bills, where you can't have an abortion clinic with halls that are less than 10 feet wide. Doesn't have anything to do with anything. It's just a barrier that legislators can throw up. In Arizona, a measure passed last year restricting the use of mail-in ballots. In Ohio, almost 200,000 voters, most of them black and poor, were purged from the rolls last year. In January last year, Texas Secretary of State David Whitley issued an election advisory stating that almost 100,000 non-citizens were registered to vote, which was a lie. And in Wisconsin on Friday, a judge has ordered 200,000 names purged from the rolls. And this was a voter caging scheme. They all received a letter a couple of months ago. And if you didn't respond to the letter confirming that you're at the same address you've always been at, you get purged from the voter rolls. Now, I'm glad to see in Wisconsin, Democrats are not just taking this passively. They are going to use public records requests to get a hold of all the names purged from the voter rolls, and then they're going to reach out to them and make sure that these people are re-registered. According to, Ben Wickler, state party chairman in Wisconsin, this is an organizing challenge, not a crisis. It just adds to our to-do list. It's a reason to work, not a reason to freak out. But in Georgia, which was the epicenter of a manipulated election rigged by the current governor who was Secretary of State, he ran his own election. And you know that Stacey Abrams fought hard, and her group is still active. But with the latest effort to purge more voters, they released a list of 313,000 people whose registrations are at risk of being canceled. That's about 4% of voters in the state of Florida. Today I'm releasing a fresh interview that has already played at Who, What, Why. I talked with Faiza Patel. She is the director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program at NYU, and they are plaintiffs in a lawsuit that's challenging the new State Department rules that require foreigners who apply for a visa in the United States to disclose all of their social media accounts. And while this is aimed at people who visit our country, it impacts citizens already who are likely in touch with those potential visitors via social media. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Faiza Patel.
There's been no study demonstrating that looking at people's social media is going to allow you to identify threats to public safety. And in fact, there have been some pilot programs that were run by the Department of Homeland Security, and the Inspector General of the department issued a report about these programs back in 2017 and found that DHS actually hadn't bothered to evaluate whether these programs were effective in meeting their supposed goal, and that these programs didn't provide a suitable basis for building out an entire new set of programs. And also, back in 2016, when there was a transition between DHS, between sort of the Obama administration and the Trump administration, these pilot programs were discussed in transition documents put together by DHS officials. And the consistent theme that we found in these documents was that they did not find these programs to be useful. They did not think that looking at social media helped them to identify security threats for a number of reasons, including, sort of the difficulty of interpretation, local language, different cultural norms, just basically the way people work, talk on social media, which is often short form or like in-jokes or sarcastic. So for all of these reasons, they had difficulty they didn't find any national security use in social media.
You can hear my full interview with Faiza Patel. It's available for subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, at TuneIn, iTunes, Spreaker, and Stitcher. James Comey went on TV yesterday claiming some vindication for his role in the Russiagate investigation. And this responds to the criticism by the Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, in his report issued a week ago yesterday. And Comey, he had some truthiness moments. He said while the Inspector General didn't find misconduct by FBI personnel, didn't find political bias, didn't find illegal conduct, that the significant mistakes identified by the IG are not something to sneeze at. And in one quote, he did actually say that he had been wrong and the IG was right about the sloppiness of the procedures the FBI used for those FISA court warrant applications. Comey claims it's hard to get a FISA court warrant. I don't believe that. But, he offered a modest mea culpa that he had been wrong about that. This led to attacks by Trump, who wants Jim Comey in jail and wants him in jail for years. Here's a tweet. So now Comey's admitting he was wrong. Wow. But he's only doing so because he got caught red-handed. He was actually caught a long time ago. So what are the consequences for his unlawful conduct? Could it be years in jail? Where are the apologies to me and others, Jim? And it would be one thing if Trump were an honorable person who was dealing with the truth. There are severe criticisms that I've leveled at James Comey. And if Trump weren't so pointedly self-serving, some of his attacks on Comey might stick. And meanwhile, I want to keep the heat on for FISA court reform. As you know, I think it should be completely abolished, and I don't expect that to ever happen. But when Lindsey Graham uttered his call to reform the FISA court, Ron Wyden, the Democratic senator from Oregon, who has been trying to reform FISA for years, said, well, I'm still trying to get my arms around the proposition that a whole bunch of conservative Republicans who have logged years blocking bipartisan FISA reforms are now somehow privacy hawks. Well, he's right, but I hope he'll get past that and see if we can get to some honest reform of FISA. Rick Gates was the business partner of Paul Manafort when they evaded taxes on millions of dollars that they earned working for the kleptocrat and target of the U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. So Rick Gates, who testified against Manafort and against Roger Stone, was so helpful to prosecutors that he's been given this slap on the wrists. He has to serve 45 days in jail, but they don't have to be all at one time. He can go in for a weekend, maybe spend a Thursday night, and when the 45 days are cumulatively completed, he'll just be on probation. He also has to pay a $20,000 fine. I mean, that's parking meter money for these guys who shoveled millions out of Ukraine. So keep in mind that Paul Manafort and his buddy Rick Gates were never convicted of anything to do with the schemes that were alleged by the Democrats and supported by the yellow journalism in the mainstream media. Supreme Court surprised me on this one. They declined to take up the case from Boise in the law that banned sleeping in public outdoor spaces by people who don't have a home. And just when I thought that we had the cruelest Supreme Court in American history, I guess I have to soften that a little, because this is a compassionate response to a very complicated problem. Capital punishment declined sharply in this country in 2018. We only executed 22 prisoners in 7 states. The peak was 98 across the country in 1999, and a new report from the Death Penalty Information Center argues that 2019 could have been the year of executing the innocent. In August, Texas executed Larry Swearingen, who had always claimed he was innocent of the murder he was convicted of from 1998. We also have the case Alabama executed Dominique Ray in February, convicted and sentenced in 1999 for raping and killing a teenage girl. The jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and no physical evidence linked him to the case. 2 other prisoners, Clifford Williams in Florida, Charles Ray Finch in North Carolina, were exonerated and set free as innocent men. And so it just shows the arbitrary nature of our death penalty system in this country. Cory Booker has gotten all of the other remaining Democratic presidential candidates to sign on to his letter to the Democratic National Committee, asking them to loosen the rules for him to participate in presidential debates. And I oppose this. I recognize that it's all white people left on the stage, and that Julian Castro and Cory Booker and Tulsi Gabbard can make a legitimate claim that, the Democratic Party is not as inclusive and as diverse as it claims to be. But these rules have been in place for everybody since the beginning, and I think that to change them at this point is to create special treatment for people who are non-white. And I'm sorry. I think that if the voters wanted a candidate of color, the polls and the financial contributions would reflect that. So I'm not in favor of changing those rules. Boeing has suspended the production of the 737 MAX. They have 400 units that are completed, but nobody will buy them. And the entire fleet worldwide has been grounded, and they keep looking for a fig leaf of when they're going to be allowed to fly the existing planes again. And I think Boeing has to accept that that may never happen. This could lead to at least a mini recession in the aircraft construction industry, and it could actually reduce the gross domestic product of the United States in the coming year. More than 100 medical doctors have issued an urgent appeal to the government of Australia to protect the life of its citizen, Julian Assange, who appears to be dying in the Belmarsh prison, or at least is in a severe health crisis. And these doctors are urging the Australian foreign minister to negotiate Assange's safe passage from Belmarsh prison to an appropriate hospital setting in Australia before it is too late. You can see the petition at consortiumnews.com, and there's a link in the show file for today's podcast. And finally, I really was impressed with Greg Palast in our interview last week and the depth of knowledge that he displayed about utilities, not only in California, where he worked for the Public Utility Commission, but in New York and Ohio as well. And he trounced, he just slammed Governor Newsom over the expected approval of the latest bankruptcy plan submitted by Pacific Gas and Electric. And to our surprise, and I wonder if Governor Gavin Newsom spent a few minutes listening to my interview with Greg Palast, because he slammed PG&E on Friday and rejected the settlement, told them to go back to the drawing board, and we'll see if he holds to that position. Ultimately, I think PG&E needs to be transferred to public ownership, and I hope that ultimately does happen. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smile.